The morning sun rose over the massive factory complex that stretched across the valley like a sleeping giant, and Marcus Hayes stood outside the main gate wearing old jeans and a faded jacket that had seen better days, and his shoes were scuffed and worn at the edges, and nobody would guess that this man in simple clothes owned everything they could see before them. Marcus was 43 years old and had built this company from nothing, and Titan Industries now employed over 50,000 people across 12 different planets. But today he was not Marcus Hayes the billionaire, and today he was just another worker showing up for his shift with a fake name badge that read Marcus Delgado. He walked through the security gate, and the scanner beeped as it read his temporary worker card. And the guard barely looked up from his screen, and Marcus made a mental note of that because security should always check faces, not just cards. And that was the first problem he noticed inside the main building. A young woman sat at the reception desk and her name tag said Kate Morrison, and she was scrolling through her phone when Marcus approached and showed her his badge, and she glanced at it for maybe 2 seconds before waving him through without even checking the computer system. Kate said in a bored voice, and she looked at his clothes with obvious disgust, and her nose wrinkled slightly as if she smelled something bad. And Marcus said nothing, but he remembered her face and her attitude. The factory floor was enormous, and machines hummed and workers moved between stations carrying tools and parts, and the air smelled of metal and oil, and giant robot arms welded pieces together with bright sparks flying, and it should have been an impressive sight, but Marcus noticed things that worried him deeply. Safety rails along the upper walkways were rusty and bent, and warning lights that should have been flashing were dark or broken, and a puddle of green liquid pooled near one machine, and workers just stepped around it instead of cleaning it up or reporting it. And these were serious safety violations. Marcus pulled out his clipboard and started taking notes, and he wrote down everything he saw, and every broken rail and every ignored hazard and every safety rule that was being violated, and his pen moved quickly across the paper, filling page after page. A loud voice suddenly shouted from across the floor, and Marcus looked up to see a short man with a red face marching toward him, and the man wore a supervisor badge and his belly hung over his belt. And this was Danny Chen, the floor manager. Danny stopped right in front of Marcus and looked him up and down with obvious contempt, and he gestured at Marcus's worn clothes and laughed, and several workers nearby stopped what they were doing to watch. Danny said loudly, and his breath smelled like cheap coffee and cigarettes, and he poked Marcus in the chest with one finger, and Marcus looked at him calmly and said nothing. Marcus replied quietly, and he held up his badge showing his inspector credentials, and Danny snatched the badge from his hand and squinted at it. Danny said with a nasty grin, and he tossed the badge back at Marcus, who caught it easily, and Marcus simply nodded and walked away. And behind him he could hear Danny laughing and making jokes to the other workers about the poor inspector who could not afford decent clothes. Marcus continued his inspection, moving through different sections of the factory, and in the assembly area he found loose cables hanging from the ceiling. And in the packaging zone he saw workers lifting heavy boxes without any safety equipment. And in the break room, the chairs were broken and the vending machines were empty. But what bothered Marcus most was how the managers treated the workers, and he watched as supervisors yelled at people for small mistakes, and he saw workers being denied bathroom breaks because production quotas had to be met, and he heard managers making cruel jokes about employees who asked questions or raised concerns. At lunchtime, Marcus sat alone in the cafeteria eating a simple sandwich he had brought from home, and the managers sat at a big table in the center, eating expensive meals that had been delivered from outside, and they laughed loudly and talked about their new cars and vacation plans. A woman named Helen Cruz seemed to be in charge of the group, and she was the operations director, and everyone hung on her every word, and she had gray hair pulled back tight and wore an expensive suit, and she was complaining about the workers. Helen said between bites of her steak, and the others nodded and agreed with everything she said, and Marcus ate his sandwich and listened carefully, and he was learning more about his company than any report could ever tell. One manager named Greg Powell noticed Marcus sitting alone, and he pointed and said something to the others, and they all turned to look and started laughing. And Greg raised his voice so Marcus could hear him clearly. Greg announced, and more laughter followed, and Marcus kept eating his sandwich and made another note on his clipboard, and he would remember Greg Powell after Lunch Marcus went to the manufacturing wing where the most complex products were made, and this area required special training and certification to enter, and the work was dangerous because it involved high-pressure systems and toxic chemicals. As he walked through checking equipment, he noticed that many of the emergency shutoff switches were covered in dust, and nobody had tested them in months, maybe years, and the emergency exits were blocked by storage containers and the fire extinguishers were expired. Marcus photographed everything with a small camera hidden in his pen, and every violation and every hazard and every failure of management. And he had dozens of photos by mid-afternoon, and his clipboard was filled with notes. Then something happened that changed everything, and a loud alarm started blaring in Sector 7, and red lights flashed along the ceiling, and workers started running toward the exits, and Marcus knew immediately what was wrong, and there was a containment breach in the clean room where sensitive computer parts were made. Marcus ran toward the emergency control panel, and he knew exactly where it was, because he had designed this whole facility 5 years ago, and his fingers flew over the controls, entering codes that only top executives should know. Heavy metal doors slammed down, sealing off the contaminated area, and emergency fans roared to life, sucking out the dangerous particles. And within 60 seconds, the breach was contained and the alarm stopped, and the crisis was over. Danny Chen came running up, red-faced and breathing hard, and he stared at Marcus standing at the control panel. And then he looked at the sealed doors, and then back at Marcus, and his mouth opened and closed. But no words came out. Finally, Danny found his voice, and he pointed at Marcus with a shaking finger, and security guards were arriving now along with other managers, including Helen Cruz. Helen pushed through the crowd, and she looked at the control panel, then at Marcus, and her eyes were sharp and suspicious, and Marcus just smiled calmly. Marcus said quietly. Helen snapped, and she turned to the security chief, and the guards moved forward and took Marcus by the arms, and they escorted him off the factory floor, while workers and managers watched in confusion as they led him away. Marcus allowed himself a small smile, and tomorrow was going to be very interesting, and tomorrow everyone would learn the truth, and tomorrow these people would discover that the poor worker they had mocked and insulted was actually the man who owned everything, including their jobs and their futures. The next morning arrived with unusual tension in the air, and workers filed through the security gates as they did every day. But something felt different, and word had spread that there would be an emergency meeting in the main auditorium, and all production was being stopped, and every single employee had to attend. Nobody knew what the meeting was about, but rumors flew like wildfire, and some said the factory was closing, and others thought there would be mass layoffs, and a few whispered that the CEO himself was coming to visit. And that last rumor seemed the most unlikely because Marcus Hayes never visited the factories, and he was too important and too busy. Danny Chen sat in the third row of the auditorium, trying to look calm, but his hands were sweating. And he kept thinking about yesterday and that weird inspector who had somehow known the emergency codes, and the man who had stopped the containment breach, and something about that whole situation bothered him deeply. Helen Cruz stood near the stage reviewing reports on her tablet, and she had spent half the night trying to find information about Marcus Delgado, the inspector, and the records looked normal. But something felt wrong, and the man had known too much, and he had moved too confidently. And those override codes he had used were restricted to only the highest-level executives. Kate Morrison, the receptionist, sat in the back, nervously chewing her nails, and she barely remembered the inspector from yesterday. And just another worker in cheap clothes, and she had not even bothered to check his credentials properly. And now she worried that her laziness might have caused problems. Greg Powell and his friends from the management team sat together making jokes and laughing, and they had no idea what was coming. And they thought this was just another boring corporate meeting where some executive would lecture them about working harder and meeting targets. At exactly 8 o'clock, the lights dimmed, and the crowd of 3,000 employees fell silent, and a woman walked onto the stage, and she was Patricia Lynn, the chief of operations, and she wore a dark suit, and her expression was serious. Patricia said into the microphone, and her voice echoed through the large space, and she paused and looked out at the crowd. And in the third row, Danny Chen sat up straighter, trying to look professional. Patricia continued, and there was tension in her voice. And she paused again, letting the silence build. And Helen Cruz near the stage felt her stomach tighten, and something was very wrong. From the side of the stage, a man appeared, and he was wearing an expensive suit, tailored perfectly to fit, and his shoes gleamed under the lights, and he walked with confidence and authority. And this was clearly someone important, and the crowd began to applaud, as was customary when the CEO appeared. But the applause was confused and scattered, and people were squinting at the stage trying to see the man's face. Clearly, and something about him looked familiar and very familiar. Helen Cruz felt the blood drain from her face, and her tablet slipped from her hands and clattered on the floor, and that face and those eyes and the way he walked, and this was the inspector from yesterday, and the man in the cheap clothes and the vagrant they had mocked and arrested. But that was impossible. Danny Chen made a choking sound, and his face went pale, and he gripped the armrests of his chair so hard, his knuckles turned white, and the other managers around him noticed his reaction and turned to look, and one of them whispered a question, but Danny could not answer, and he was staring at the stage in complete horror. Kate Morrison in the back row gasped, and her hand flew to her mouth, and the poor worker she had dismissed yesterday, without even checking his badge properly, and the man she had looked at with disgust, and he was standing on that stage in a suit that probably cost more than her yearly salary. Greg Powell stopped laughing, and his smile froze on his face, then slowly melted away, and the inspector and the man he had mocked in the cafeteria, and the vagrant he had made fun of in front of everyone, and that man was Marcus Hayes, and the owner of everything. Marcus walked to the center of the stage and stood at the podium, and he placed his hands on the lectern and looked out at the crowd, and his expression was calm. But his eyes were hard, and when he spoke his voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the auditorium. He let those words hang in the air, and 3,000 people stared back at him, and some were confused, and some were shocked, and many were beginning to understand, and their faces showed fear. Marcus continued, and behind him a huge screen lit up, and images appeared, and photos of rusty safety rails, and videos of ignored spills, and pictures of blocked emergency exits, and every violation that Marcus had documented during his inspection. The crowd murmured, and workers looked at their managers with accusing eyes, and managers looked at the floor or their shoes or anywhere. But at the stage, more images appeared on the screen, and security footage showing managers leaving early, while workers stayed late, and expense reports showing lavish dinners and expensive trips, and email records showing worker complaints that had been ignored or deleted. Marcus said, and he clicked a button, and a number appeared on the screen in huge red letters, and 43, and the crowd gasped. The screen changed again, and now it showed video from yesterday and the containment breach in Sector 7, and everyone watched as the alarm sounded, and as workers ran, and as managers stood frozen, not knowing what to do. Then they watched as a figure in worn clothes moved quickly to the control panel, and the figure entered codes and activated protocols, and within seconds the breach was contained, and the danger was over, and the figure turned slightly, and the camera caught his face clearly, and it was Marcus Hayes. The screen split, and on one side was Marcus from yesterday in his cheap jacket and old shoes, and on the other side was Marcus now in his expensive suit, and same man, and different clothes, and the resemblance was undeniable. Danny Chen had slumped in his seat, and his head was in his hands, and he knew his career was over, and everything he had worked for was gone, and all because he had judged a man by his appearance instead of his actions. Helen Cruz stood frozen like a statue, and her arms were crossed tight across her chest, and her jaw was clenched, and she was angry, but also afraid, and she knew what was coming, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Greg Powell was staring at his hands, and his face was red with shame, and he remembered every joke he had made, and every cruel comment, and every laugh at the poor inspector's expense. And now that inspector owned the company and owned everything, and including Greg's future, Marcus let the silence stretch, and he had learned that silence could be more powerful than words, and he looked at each manager in turn, making eye contact, and some met his gaze, and most looked away. He finally said, and his voice was still quiet, but now it had an edge of steel, and behind him more images appeared, and personnel files, and performance reviews, and documentation of every failure, every violation, every moment of cruelty or negligence. A worker complaint about unsafe conditions appeared on screen, and it was 6 months old, and below it the manager's response dismissing the concern, and the signature was clearly visible, and Danny Chen and the date of the containment breach appeared next to it, and the breach that could have been prevented if someone had listened. Another document appeared, and a maintenance request for safety equipment and denied due to budget cuts, and the signature belonged to Helen Cruz, and next to it the cost of the emergency repairs, needed after yesterday's breach and 10 times more expensive than the original maintenance would have been. More files and more signatures and more evidence, and every manager who had cut corners or ignored problems or treated workers with contempt, and all of it documented and all of it displayed for everyone to see. Marcus looked directly at Danny Chen, who flinched under that gaze, and then his eyes moved to Helen Cruz, who stood rigid with fear and anger, and then to Greg Powell, who had gone, pale as a ghost, and then to Kate Morrison, who was crying quietly in the back row. Marcus said calmly, and Patricia Lynn stepped forward carrying a tablet, and she handed it to Marcus, and he looked down at it, then back at the crowd, and the moment of judgment had arrived. Marcus looked down at the tablet in his hands, and the list of names glowed on the screen, and 17 managers who had failed in their duties, and 17 people who had let safety slide and who had treated workers like dirt, and who had valued their own comfort over the lives of others. He began to read, and his voice was steady and clear, and each word fell like a hammer blow. In the silent auditorium, Danny Chen stood up so fast, his chair fell over backward with a loud crash, and his face was bright red and sweat poured down his forehead despite the cool air, and he started to speak, but his voice cracked. Danny tried to say, and security guards were already moving through the rows of seats, and 2 of them positioned themselves on either side of Danny, and their faces were professional and calm, and they had done this before. Marcus said, cutting through Danny's protests, and his voice was cold as ice. And he looked down at the tablet again and continued reading. Danny looked around, desperately seeking support from his fellow managers, and nobody met his eyes, and they were all looking at their hands or the floor or the ceiling and anywhere but at Danny's face. And the security guards took his arms gently but firmly and began escorting him toward the exit. Danny shouted as they led him away, and his voice echoed through the auditorium. But nobody responded, and the doors closed behind him with a final thud, and he was gone. Marcus continued reading from the tablet, and Helen Cruz had been standing near the stage, but now she sank slowly into a seat, and her face had gone from red to white, and her hands gripped the armrests so tight, her fingers were shaking. More security guards moved toward Helen, and she stood up on her own before they reached her, and she walked toward the exit with her head held high, trying to maintain some dignity. But her legs were unsteady, and her eyes were wet with unshed tears. And 20 years with the company and gone in an instant. Marcus kept reading, and Greg Powell, who had mocked Marcus in the cafeteria, heard his name and closed his eyes. And Kate Morrison, the receptionist, who had barely glanced at Marcus's badge, started crying harder, and one by one the names were called, and one by one security escorted them out. The remaining managers sat frozen in their seats, and some were relieved they had survived, and others were terrified. They might be next, and the workers watched with mixed feelings, and this was justice, but it was also frightening to see how quickly everything could change when the last name was read, and the last manager escorted out. Marcus set down the tablet, and he gripped the edges of the podium and looked out at the remaining employees, and his posture shifted slightly, and he was no longer the prosecutor delivering judgment, and now he was a teacher explaining a lesson. He gestured to the images still displayed on the screen behind him, and the violations and the failures and the dangerous conditions that had been allowed to develop. The screen changed to show a detailed map of the factory, and every violation Marcus had found was marked with a red dot, and there were dozens of them in hundreds, and the factory looked like it had a disease spreading. Through it, new images appeared, and these showed workers and men and women who had done their jobs well despite pressure from above, and people who had tried to report problems, and employees who had refused to cut corners even when managers demanded it one by one. Marcus called out names, but this time he was not firing anyone, and he was promoting them, and Lisa Thompson, who had been a senior technician for 15 years, became the new floor manager, and Carlos Rodriguez, who had run a small team, was now operations director, and good people who had been held down by bad management were finally getting the recognition they deserved. The workers began to applaud, and this time the applause was genuine and enthusiastic, and these were their friends and colleagues being honored and people they respected and trusted, and the mood in the auditorium shifted from fear to hope. Marcus raised his hand for silence, and the applause died down, and he continued speaking, and his voice was warmer now and less harsh, and he was no longer the angry judge but a leader trying to inspire his people. He detailed his plans, and new safety equipment would be installed immediately, and the budget for maintenance would triple, and every safety rail would be replaced, and every warning system would be upgraded, and every hazard would be eliminated. But the changes would not stop there, and the cafeteria would be renovated, and the food would be better and healthier, and the break rooms would get comfortable. Furniture and entertainment systems and the locker rooms would be expanded and modernized, and workers would be treated with respect and dignity. Marcus explained that there would be a new reporting system, and any worker could report a problem anonymously, without fear of punishment, and every report would be investigated by an independent team, and managers who ignored safety concerns would be fired immediately, and no exceptions. He also announced that top executives, including himself, would make regular surprise visits, and they would walk the factory floor, and they would talk to workers, and they would see conditions with their own eyes, and never again would management lose touch with reality, and never again would problems be hidden behind false reports and lies. The workers were nodding now, and some were smiling, and this was what they had wanted for years, and someone who cared, and someone who listened, and someone who would fix the problems instead of ignoring them. Marcus looked around the auditorium, making eye contact with as many people as he could, and he wanted them to see that he was serious, and that this was not just empty promises, and that real change was coming. He paused, and then added one more thing, and the workers erupted in cheers, and this was better than they had ever hoped, and not only would conditions improve, but they would be rewarded for their hard work and loyalty. Marcus stepped back from the podium, and Patricia Lynn came forward again to handle the practical details, but before he left the stage, Marcus said one final thing, and his voice was quiet, but everyone heard him. He looked out at the crowd one last time, and then he walked off the stage, and the auditorium exploded in applause, and this time it was not polite corporate clapping, and it was genuine appreciation and respect, and the workers stood and cheered, and some were crying with relief and joy. In the back of the auditorium, a young worker named Jake turned to his friend, and his friend nodded, and they both knew they were witnessing something special, and something that would change everything. Outside the auditorium, the fired managers were being processed by security, and they had to turn in their badges and clear out their offices. And Danny Chen sat in his car with his head on the steering wheel, and 20 years of his life gone because he had been cruel to a man in cheap clothes. Helen Cruz walked to her car with a box of personal items from her desk, and she got in and sat there for a long time staring at nothing, and she thought about all the warnings she had ignored, and all the complaints she had dismissed, and all the safety concerns she had buried to save money, and now it had all caught up with her. Greg Powell was already on his phone calling other companies trying to find a new job, but word had spread fast, and everyone in the industry knew what had happened, and nobody wanted to hire the managers who had been fired by Marcus Hayes, and their reputations were destroyed. Inside, the factory workers were returning to their stations, but everything felt different now, and the air seemed lighter, and people were smiling and talking excitedly, and they had hope again, and they believed things would actually get better. Lisa Thompson, the new floor manager, stood on the factory floor and looked around, and she had worked here for 15 years, and she knew every machine, and she knew every worker, and now she had the power to make real changes and to fix the problems she had seen for so long, and she felt both excited and terrified, but mostly she felt grateful for the chance. Marcus sat in his office on the top floor looking out the window at the factory below, and he felt tired but satisfied, and the hard part was done, and now came the real work of rebuilding and improving. But he knew it would be worth it. And this was what leadership meant, and not sitting in comfortable offices, but seeing the truth, and having the courage to act on it. 1 week after the big meeting, the changes began to happen fast, and construction crews arrived before dawn to start replacing the rusty safety rails, and new warning systems were installed throughout the factory, and maintenance teams worked around the clock-fixing equipment that had been broken for months or even years. Lisa Thompson walked the factory floor with her clipboard checking progress, and she had been in meetings all week with the new management team, and they had made lists of every problem that needed fixing, and the list was pages long, but they were working through it systematically. Workers watched the changes with amazement, and the green puddle that had been there for months was cleaned up, and the leaking machine was repaired, and the blocked emergency exits were cleared, and new fire extinguishers were mounted on every wall, and fresh safety equipment was distributed to everyone who needed it. But the physical changes were only part of the transformation, and the bigger shift was in how people treated each other. And the new managers did not yell or insult workers, and they asked questions and listened to answers. And when someone reported a problem, it was fixed quickly, instead of being ignored. Jake, the young worker who had been at the meeting, was operating his machine when Lisa approached, and he tensed up expecting criticism. And that was what he was used to from the old managers. But Lisa just smiled. Jake blinked in surprise, and nobody had ever asked him that before, and he thought for a moment, then pointed to a control panel. Lisa pulled out her tablet and made a note, and she added, and Jake felt a surge of pride, and his opinion mattered. And someone was actually listening to him. This scene repeated itself dozens of times across the factory, and managers asking workers for input, and workers giving suggestions that were actually implemented, and ideas flowing up, instead of just orders flowing down. And it was a revolution in how the place operated. The cafeteria renovation finished in record time, and the workers walked in on Monday morning and stopped in amazement, and new tables and chairs had been installed, and the walls were freshly painted in warm colors, and the food service area had been completely rebuilt with modern equipment. But the biggest surprise was the food itself. And gone were the terrible synthetic meals that nobody liked. And now there were real vegetables from the agricultural colonies, and fresh fruit and properly cooked meat, and the quality was 10 times better, and somehow the prices were actually lower than before. A worker named Susan sat down with her tray and took a bite, and her eyes went wide, and her friend Rachel sat across from her, and Susan just shook her head in wonder. The break rooms were upgraded next, and new couches and comfortable chairs appeared, and large screens were installed for watching shows during breaks, and gaming systems were set up for people who wanted to relax, and the spaces went from depressing gray boxes to actually pleasant places to spend time. Workers started taking their full breaks instead of rushing back to their stations, and they laughed and talked and actually enjoyed their time off. And productivity did not drop as the old managers had claimed it would, and in fact it started to rise, and happy workers were better workers. The new anonymous reporting system went live in the second week, and workers could submit safety concerns or problems through secure terminals without giving their names, and every single report was reviewed by a special team that reported directly to Carlos Rodriguez, the new operations director. The first day the system went live, it received over 100 reports, and some were minor issues and others were serious problems that had been hidden for years, and Carlos and his team worked through them, methodically investigating each one and taking action. One report detailed how a supervisor in Sector 4 had been forcing workers to skip safety checks to meet quotas, and the supervisor was called in for a meeting, and Carlos showed him the evidence, and the supervisor tried to make excuses. But Carlos cut him off. The supervisor was given one chance to change his behavior, and he was told clearly that if there was another report about him, he would be fired immediately, and no second chances. And the message spread quickly, and the new management was serious about safety. Marcus made his second surprise visit in the third week, and this time he came in business casual clothes instead of the worn jacket and jeans, but he still walked the floor talking to workers and checking conditions, and he spent an hour with Lisa going over her progress reports. Lisa showed him the numbers, and production was up and quality defects were down, and worker satisfaction scores had jumped dramatically, and the changes were working even better than hoped. Marcus asked, and Lisa nodded. Marcus smiled, and that was exactly what he wanted to hear, and not complaints or excuses, but solutions and improvements, and the culture was changing from reactive to proactive. He walked to the manufacturing floor and stopped at a workstation, and the operator was a woman in her 50s named Linda, and she had been with the company for 20 years, and Marcus recognized her from his undercover visit. And she had been one of the workers who had looked at him with sympathy when Danny Chen was shouting. Linda looked up and her eyes went wide, and then she smiled, and Marcus waited. And Linda thought for a moment. Marcus pulled out his phone and made a note, and Linda looked shocked, and Marcus nodded seriously. As he walked away, Linda stood there stunned, and the CEO had not only asked her opinion but had actually written it down and promised to act on it, and she turned back to her machine with a huge smile, and she could not wait to tell her husband tonight. Word of that interaction spread through the factory like wildfire, and the CEO was not just making grand speeches, and he was actually listening to regular workers, and he cared about their ideas, and people started thinking about improvements and innovations they could suggest. The locker room renovation finished by the end of the month, and what had been cramped, dirty spaces were now clean, modern facilities and new lockers and better lighting and proper ventilation and clean showers with hot water that actually worked reliably. These might have seemed like small things to outsiders, but to the workers they meant everything, and they showed that management valued them as people, not just as labor units, and they showed respect and dignity. One evening, Carlos was working late in his office when he got an unexpected visitor, and it was Jake, the young worker who had suggested the control panel improvement, and he knocked nervously on the door frame. Carlos looked up and smiled, and Jake came in holding a folder. He opened the folder and showed Carlos detailed sketches and calculations, and he had spent weeks thinking about it and working on it in his spare time, and it was a complete redesign of the assembly process that could increase efficiency by 15%, while also improving safety. Carlos studied the papers carefully, and this was good work and really good work, and the kind of innovation that used to get buried because workers were afraid to speak up or managers were too arrogant to listen. Jake's face lit up like the sun, and Carlos continued, and Jake nodded eagerly, and after he left, Carlos sat back in his chair and smiled. And this was what good management looked like. And this was what happened when you treated people right and listened to their ideas. Meanwhile, in another city, Danny Chen sat in his apartment scrolling through job listings, and nobody would hire him. And the story of what had happened had spread throughout the industry, and everyone knew he had mocked and insulted Marcus Hayes, and everyone knew he had ignored safety violations, and his career was over. Helen Cruz had taken a job at a much smaller company for half her previous salary, and she worked in a tiny office instead of a corner suite, and every day she thought about what she had lost, and all because she had valued money over people, and all because she had forgotten what really mattered. Greg Powell had moved back to Earth and was working in his brother's small business, and he loaded trucks and did inventory, and it was honest work but a far cry from his management position. And sometimes at night he thought about that day in the cafeteria when he had mocked the man in cheap clothes, and that one moment of cruelty had destroyed his entire career. The lesson was clear to everyone who heard the story: and treat people with respect, regardless of how they look, and listen to workers instead of dismissing them, and value safety over shortcuts, and care about people, not just profits. And these were simple principles, but they made all the difference between success and failure. 3 months had passed since the famous meeting, and the factory was almost unrecognizable from what it had been before, and Marcus stood at the observation window on the top floor looking down at the operation below, and everything ran smoothly now, and the machines hummed with perfect precision, and workers moved with confidence and purpose, and the entire atmosphere had changed. Carlos Rodriguez knocked on the door and entered carrying his tablet, and he looked tired but satisfied and running. Operations was demanding work, but he loved every minute of it. He showed Marcus the screen, and the numbers were impressive, and production had increased by 32%, and quality defects had dropped to almost zero, and worker satisfaction scores had reached the highest levels in company history. Marcus studied the data carefully, and these were not just good numbers, and they were exceptional, and they proved what he had always believed. And when you treated people well, they performed better. And when you invested in safety and quality, you got better results, and it was not complicated. But somehow many companies never learned this lesson. Carlos smiled, and that made Marcus happy, and reputation mattered in business. But more importantly, it showed that their approach was working, and other companies were taking notice. That afternoon, Marcus attended a video conference with his executive team from headquarters on Luna, and Patricia Lin was there along with the heads of finance, legal, and human resources, and they were reviewing the transformation of the factory and discussing whether to implement similar changes at other facilities. The finance director, named Walter Chen, spoke up, and he had been skeptical about the costs of the improvements and all that new equipment and the renovations and the better food and the bonuses, and it had been expensive. Marcus looked at him calmly, and Walter pulled up a spreadsheet and he studied it for a moment. Then his eyes went wide. Marcus nodded, and the increased productivity more than paid for the improvements, and the reduction in accidents saved money on insurance and medical costs. And the lower turnover meant less spending on recruitment and training. And the better quality meant fewer returns and warranty claims, and every dollar spent on workers had returned $3 in benefits. Patricia Lynn smiled, and she had supported Marcus from the beginning, and she understood that short-term costs could lead to long-term gains, but seeing the actual numbers made the case undeniable. The meeting ended with unanimous approval to roll out similar programs at 3 other facilities, and Marcus felt satisfied, and the changes were spreading, and the culture was evolving. And this was what leadership meant, and not just fixing one problem, but creating a system that prevented problems from happening. Later that week, something unexpected happened, and a reporter from the biggest business news network in human space requested an interview, and she wanted to do a story about the transformation at the factory. And Marcus agreed, and this was a chance to share the lessons learned and inspire other companies to follow suit. The reporter's name was Amanda Price, and she arrived with a camera crew and spent 2 days at the facility. And she interviewed Marcus and Carlos and Lisa. But more importantly, she interviewed regular workers and people like Jake and Linda and Susan. And she asked them what had changed and how they felt about it. Jake told her about his assembly process redesign and how management had actually listened to his ideas. And Linda explained how the CEO had personally asked for her suggestions. And Susan described the difference between the old cafeteria and the new one, and every worker had a story to tell. Amanda also asked about the undercover inspection, and she wanted to know why Marcus had done it and what he had learned. And Marcus thought carefully before answering. Amanda pressed for more details, and Marcus continued, and he described being mocked and insulted and being judged by his appearance and being dismissed and ignored. But he kept his tone neutral, and he was not trying to shame anyone, and he was trying to teach a lesson. The story aired the following week, and it was the top feature on the business news program, and millions of people across dozens of colonies watched it, and the segment showed the before and after of the factory, and it included interviews with workers praising the changes, and it explained the business case for treating employees well. But the most powerful part was the footage from the security cameras, and Amanda had obtained permission to use clips from Marcus's undercover visit. And viewers watched him being mocked by Danny Chen, and they saw Greg Powell making jokes in the cafeteria, and they witnessed the contempt and cruelty that had infected the management culture. Then they saw the reveal, and Marcus on stage in his suit, and the shocked faces of the managers, and the moment when everyone realized that the vagrant they had insulted was actually the owner of everything, and it was dramatic and powerful. Television. The response was overwhelming, and the video went viral across social media, and everyone was talking about it. And business schools requested permission to use it as a case study, and other CEOs announced plans to do their own undercover inspections. And the story had touched a nerve. Marcus received thousands of messages, and some were from workers at other companies, thanking him for standing up for regular employees, and others were from executives asking for advice on how to implement similar changes, and a few were from the fired managers, apologizing for their behavior. Danny Chen sent a long email, and he admitted his mistakes, and he acknowledged how badly he had treated people, and he said he had learned his lesson and was trying to be a better person. And Marcus read the email twice, and then he replied with 3 sentences, and he did not rehire Danny, but he wished him well. Helen Cruz also reached out, and her message was shorter and more formal, and she thanked Marcus for not completely destroying her reputation, and said she understood why she had been fired, and Marcus did not reply to her email, and some lessons had to be learned the hard way. The factory continued to improve, and Jake's assembly redesign was implemented and worked even better than projected, and efficiency increased by 18%, and Jake received a promotion and a substantial bonus, and other workers started submitting their own ideas for improvements. Lisa Thompson proved to be an excellent floor manager, and she had the respect of the workers, because she had been one of them. And she understood the challenges they faced, but she also had the courage to make tough decisions when necessary. And under her leadership, the manufacturing floor became a model of efficiency and safety. Carlos Rodriguez transformed the operations department, and he hired new managers based on merit and character, rather than fancy degrees or connections, and he created systems that encouraged communication between different levels of the organization, and problems that used to take weeks to solve were now handled in days or even hours. The anonymous reporting system became one of the most valuable tools in the facility, and workers used it not just to report problems, but to suggest improvements, and the volume of reports had dropped dramatically because most issues were being caught and fixed before they became serious. But the quality of the reports that did come in was much higher. Marcus made monthly visits to the factory now, and each time he came, he wore normal business clothes, but he still spent most of his time on the floor talking to workers. And he had lunch in the cafeteria with employees, and he visited different departments and asked questions, and he made it clear that he cared about what was happening at the ground level. During one visit, a young technician named Paul approached him nervously, and Paul worked in the maintenance department, and he had been with the company for only 6 months. Marcus stopped and gave Paul his full attention, and Paul explained that he had noticed a pattern in the maintenance logs and certain machines required repairs at predictable intervals, and if they scheduled preventive maintenance just before those intervals, they could avoid breakdowns and save time and money. Marcus listened carefully, and this was exactly the kind of proactive thinking he wanted to encourage. And Paul pulled out his tablet and showed Marcus the data, and it was solid analysis and good work from someone who had only been there 6 months. Paul looked shocked, and Marcus smiled, and after Paul left, Carlos approached. Carlos laughed, and Marcus nodded, and that was the whole point. And when you created the right culture, people naturally stepped up and contributed. And they did not need to be forced or bribed, and they just needed to be respected and heard. As the months passed, the factory became famous throughout the industry, and executives from other companies visited to study their methods and business. Schools sent professors and students to observe, and the facility that had once been a cautionary tale of mismanagement was now a shining example of how things should be done. But Marcus knew the work was never finished, and culture could slip if you were not vigilant, and standards could erode if you stopped paying attention. And that was why he continued his regular visits, and that was why he maintained the anonymous reporting system, and that was why he insisted on transparency and accountability at every level. The transformation of the factory had started with one man in cheap clothes walking through the gates, and it had continued with hard decisions and painful changes. But now it was sustained by thousands of people who believed in doing things the right way, and who took pride in their work and who looked out for each other, and that was the real victory. 6 months after the transformation began, Marcus received news that made him smile, and the factory had been nominated for the Galaxy Manufacturing Excellence Award, and this was the most prestigious honor in the industry, and past winners included massive operations on Earth and Mars and Europa, and for a colony facility to even be nominated was remarkable. The award committee would visit in 2 weeks to conduct their evaluation, and they would inspect every aspect of the operation and safety, protocols and worker satisfaction and production efficiency and quality control and environmental practices and innovation, and everything would be examined in detail. Carlos gathered the management team for a meeting, and Lisa and the other department heads sat around the conference table, and everyone looked excited but also nervous, and this was a huge opportunity, but also a test, Carlos said. And the others nodded, and they had been working hard every day to maintain and improve standards, but an award inspection would reveal any weaknesses. Lisa spoke up, and the others agreed, and they were confident in their work, but they wanted to make sure everything was perfect. Over the next 2 weeks, everyone worked to prepare, and not by hiding problems or making things look good on the surface, and that was what the old management would have done. And instead they focused on making sure every system was working properly and every process was documented, and every worker understood their role and responsibilities. Jake spent extra hours making sure his assembly redesign was performing at peak efficiency, and Linda and her team double-checked all the safety equipment, and Paul implemented his preventive maintenance schedule ahead of time to make sure no machines would break down during the inspection. The workers understood what was at stake, and this award would validate all their efforts, and it would prove that their approach to manufacturing was not just good, but the best. And they took pride in their work, and they wanted the world to see it. Marcus arrived 3 days before the inspection, and he wanted to observe the preparation and make sure everyone stayed focused on substance over appearance. And he watched as teams worked together, checking systems and reviewing procedures, and nobody was panicking or cutting corners, and they were simply doing their jobs well. The night before the inspection, Marcus had dinner in the cafeteria with a random group of workers, and he sat at their table and asked how they felt about the evaluation, and a woman named Rita, who worked in quality control, answered first. Others at the table agreed, and they were not worried because they knew their work was good, and they had nothing to hide and no false reports or covered-up problems, and everything was genuine and real. Marcus felt a surge of pride, and this was what he had been trying to build. And not a place where people were afraid of inspections, but a place where inspections were welcomed because everyone knew they were doing things right. The inspection team arrived the next morning, and there were 5 of them and senior executives from other companies and industry experts and former regulators, and they had inspected hundreds of facilities across human space, and they had seen the best and the worst of manufacturing operations. The lead inspector was a woman named Dr. Chen, who had 30 years of experience, and she had a reputation for being thorough and fair, but also very demanding, and nothing escaped her attention, and she could spot problems that others missed. Carlos and Lisa gave them a brief overview, then let them explore freely, and the inspectors split up to examine different areas, and they checked safety equipment, and they reviewed maintenance logs, and they interviewed workers at random, and they tested emergency systems, and they studied production data. Dr. Chen spent an hour talking to Jake about his assembly redesign, and she asked detailed, technical questions, and she wanted to understand not just what he had done, but how he had come up with the idea, and how it had been implemented, and Jake explained everything clearly and confidently. Another inspector interviewed Linda, and he asked about safety protocols and training procedures, and Linda showed him the records and explained how they conducted regular drills and reviews, and she was proud of her safety record, and 0 serious accidents in 6 months. A third inspector tested the anonymous reporting system, and he submitted a fake complaint about a fictional problem, and within 15 minutes he received an automated response confirming receipt, and within 2 hours someone from management contacted him to discuss the issue, and the system worked exactly as designed. The inspection lasted 3 full days, and the team examined everything, and they found a few minor issues and a loose bolt on a railing, and a mislabeled supply container, and a typo in a training manual. But these were truly minor, and nothing that affected safety or quality, and nothing that suggested systemic problems. On the final day, Dr. Chen requested a meeting with Marcus, Carlos, and Lisa, and they gathered in the conference room, and the inspector's face was neutral, giving nothing away, and Marcus felt a flutter of nervousness but kept his expression calm. Dr. Chen began, and she paused and looked at each of them, and she pulled out her tablet and displayed a report. She scrolled through the data, and she continued listing categories and safety protocols and quality control and environmental compliance and worker satisfaction and innovation. And in every category, the factory had scored at the top level, Dr. Chen said, and she looked directly at Marcus, and Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion, and this was what they had worked for, and this was the validation that their approach was right. Dr. Chen smiled for the first time, and Carlos and Lisa looked at each other with huge grins, and they had done it, and against all odds they had taken a failing facility and turned it into an award winner. The news spread through the factory within minutes, and workers cheered and hugged each other, and the cafeteria became a spontaneous celebration, and people who had worked so hard for so long finally had proof that their efforts mattered. Jake found himself surrounded by colleagues congratulating him on his assembly redesign, and Linda was lifted onto shoulders and carried around like a hero, and Paul received dozens of handshakes and backslaps, and everyone who had contributed to the transformation was being recognized and celebrated. Marcus stood to the side watching the celebration, and Patricia Lynn called him from headquarters, and she had heard the news, and her voice was filled with pride and excitement. Marcus smiled, and he looked at the celebrating workers, and he continued, and Patricia laughed, and she understood, and this was bigger than one award or one facility, and this was about changing how business was done. That evening, Marcus stood at the observation window again, and below him the factory hummed with perfect precision. But now it also hummed with something more important, and pride and joy, and a sense of shared accomplishment, and the workers were not just doing a job, and they were part of something meaningful. Carlos joined him at the window, and they stood in comfortable silence for a moment. And then Carlos spoke. Marcus nodded, and Carlos was right. And when he had walked through those gates 6 months ago in his worn jacket and faded jeans, he had seen a disaster and broken equipment and ignored hazards and cruel management and demoralized workers, and it had seemed almost hopeless. But He had also seen potential in good people who wanted to do good work, and talented individuals held back by bad leadership and systems that could work if someone cared enough to fix them, and that potential had been realized and the disaster had become a triumph. Marcus replied, and he meant it, and the award would bring attention and prestige. But the real victory was the culture they had built, and the respect between management and workers, and the commitment to safety and quality, and the willingness to innovate and improve, and those things would last long after the trophy gathered dust on a shelf. Carlos smiled, and that was the highest praise, and they watched the workers below for a few more minutes, and then they went down to join the celebration, because tonight was not about executives or awards, and it was about everyone who had worked together to achieve something remarkable, and tonight was about the team. The award ceremony took place 1 month later on Luna, at the headquarters of the Galactic Manufacturing Association, and representatives from the best facilities across human space gathered in a massive ballroom carved from lunar rock and crystal. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and servers moved through the crowd offering expensive drinks and food. Marcus attended with his core team, and Carlos and Lisa were there, along with Jake, Linda, and Paul, and he had insisted that the workers who had contributed to the transformation should be present, and they deserved to be recognized. And they had earned this moment as much as anyone. Jake looked uncomfortable in his rented suit, and he had never been to Luna before, and never attended a fancy ceremony. And he stood close to Linda, who seemed more at ease, and she had raised 3 children and learned to handle any situation with grace. Paul kept staring at the view through the transparent dome above them, and Earth hung in the black sky like a blue and white jewel, and he had seen pictures, but seeing it in person was overwhelming. And Marcus noticed his expression and smiled. The ceremony began with speeches from industry leaders, and they talked about innovation and excellence and the future of manufacturing. And Marcus listened politely, but his mind was elsewhere, and he was thinking about the journey that had brought them here. And from that morning, 6 months ago, when he had walked through the factory gates in disguise, to this moment now. Finally, the moment arrived, and Dr. Chen walked onto the stage to present the Galaxy Manufacturing Excellence Award, and she spoke about the rigorous inspection process and about the hundreds of facilities evaluated and about how difficult it was to achieve the highest standards in every category. She paused for effect, and the room fell silent, and everyone knew this was the big announcement, and she looked out at the audience with a slight smile. The ballroom erupted in applause, and Marcus and his team stood and made their way to the stage, and cameras flashed and people cheered, and Jake looked like he might faint, and Linda squeezed his arm encouragingly. Dr. Chen handed Marcus a crystal trophy, and it was heavy and beautiful, but more important was what it represented, and recognition of their hard work and validation of their approach, and proof that treating people right was not just morally correct, but also produced superior results. Marcus stepped to the microphone, and he looked out at the audience of executives and industry leaders, and these were people who controlled billions in assets, and who employed millions of workers, and who shaped the future of human civilization across the stars, and what he said now could influence how they approach their own operations. He paused and gestured to his team standing beside him, and he introduced each of them, and Jake, the young worker, whose innovation had improved efficiency, and Linda, the veteran who maintained perfect safety standards, and Paul, who had revolutionized maintenance scheduling, and Carlos and Lisa, who had led the transformation. Marcus continued, and he described walking the factory in disguise and being mocked and insulted, and seeing the violations and failures, and making the hard decision to fire 17 managers, and the audience listened in absolute silence, and many had heard the story, but hearing it directly from Marcus made it more powerful. He let those words hang in the air, and some executives in the audience shifted uncomfortably, and they knew their own operations had problems, and they knew they had been ignoring issues or prioritizing profits over people. And Marcus's story was holding up a mirror to their failures. Jake stepped forward, and his voice shook slightly but grew stronger as he spoke, and he described working under the old management and the fear and frustration and the knowledge that his ideas would be ignored. And then he described the new culture, where his voice mattered and where innovation was encouraged and where respect flowed in all directions. Linda spoke next, and she talked about safety and about how the old managers had treated it as an inconvenience, and about workers who had been injured because equipment was not maintained, and about the transformation that had made the factory the safest in the industry, and her voice was firm and clear, and she was not afraid to speak truth to power. When they finished speaking, the applause was thunderous, but it was different from the polite clapping earlier. And this was genuine enthusiasm, and people were moved by the story and inspired by the transformation, and several executives approached Marcus after the ceremony, asking detailed questions about implementation. One CEO from a major Mars facility took Marcus aside, and he looked troubled, and Marcus listened, and the CEO continued, and Marcus nodded, and he had expected this, and the story had exposed a problem many executives knew existed but did not want to face. Marcus said simply, and the CEO thanked him and walked away looking thoughtful, and Marcus knew that conversation would lead to changes, and maybe not overnight, but the seed had been planted. Later that evening, Marcus and his team celebrated in a restaurant overlooking the lunar surface, and they were exhausted but happy. And the crystal trophy sat in the center of the table, catching the light from Earth above. Jake raised his glass, and he had relaxed as the evening went on, and the others laughed and clinked glasses, and Carlos added. Linda smiled, and Paul nodded in agreement, and Marcus looked at each of them, and these people had believed in the vision, and had worked incredibly hard, and had faced challenges with courage and determination, and they had earned this success. Marcus said, raising his glass, and they all drank, and then Jake spoke up. Everyone laughed, and Marcus replied, and he meant it, and tomorrow they would return to work. And there would be new challenges and new problems to solve, and the work was never finished, but tonight they could enjoy what they had accomplished together. Back at the factory, the news of the award had spread instantly, and workers had gathered in the cafeteria to watch the ceremony on the big screens, and when Marcus's team walked onto the stage, the room had erupted in cheers, and when Jake and Linda spoke, the cheers became roars of approval. Susan stood with her colleagues watching, and she had tears in her eyes, and her friend Rita put an arm around her shoulders, and Rita said, and Susan nodded, and she felt exactly the same way. The celebration continued late into the night, and workers who rarely socialized outside of shifts stayed to enjoy the moment, and the management team that had been carefully selected over the past months mingled easily with the workforce, and there was no hierarchy tonight, and just people who had worked together to achieve something remarkable. On Earth, in his small apartment, Danny Chen watched the ceremony on his tablet, and he saw Marcus accept the award, and he saw the factory he had once managed being praised as the best in human space, and he saw Jake, the worker he had probably yelled at dozens of times, speaking on stage to industry leaders. Danny turned off the tablet and sat in the dark, and he had finally found a new job, and nothing glamorous, an assistant manager at a small warehouse. And it was honest work, but a far cry from what he had lost. And every day he thought about his mistakes, and about the moment he had mocked Marcus, and about all the opportunities he had wasted through arrogance and cruelty. Helen Cruz also watched the ceremony, and she worked at her new job at a mid-sized company, and she had a tiny office and a fraction of her former authority. And when she saw the factory win the award, she felt a sharp pain in her chest, and that could have been her achievement, and that glory could have been hers, but she had thrown it away by forgetting what truly mattered. Greg Powell did not watch the ceremony, and he could not bear to see it, and he heard about it the next day from his brother, and he nodded and said nothing, but inside he felt the weight of his choices and the casual cruelty and the thoughtless mockery, and it had seemed so harmless at the time, and now it had cost him everything. The story of Marcus Hayes and his undercover inspection became legendary in business schools across human space, and students studied it as an example of ethical leadership, and professors used it to teach about organizational culture, and executives referenced it in speeches and presentations. But the real impact was in the thousands of workplaces where leaders took the lesson to heart, and where CEOs started making surprise visits, and where managers began listening to workers, and where safety and respect became priorities, and the transformation of one factory had sparked a movement that spread across the stars. 1 year after the famous inspection, Marcus Hayes stood at the same spot outside the factory gates where he had started his journey, and the binary stars were setting over the valley, casting long shadows across the industrial complex. But everything had changed since that morning when he had walked through these gates in worn clothes and old shoes. The factory now employed 7,000 people, up from 5,000 a year ago, and production had increased by 45%, and quality ratings were the highest in the industry, and worker satisfaction scores had remained at record levels, and the facility had become a model studied and copied across human space. But numbers only told part of the story, and the real transformation was in the people. And Marcus could see it in how workers carried themselves, and heads high and shoulders back and eyes bright with purpose and pride. And they were not just doing jobs, and they were building something meaningful. Carlos Rodriguez walked up beside him, and Carlos had been promoted to vice president of operations for the entire company, and he now oversaw 15 facilities across 8 planets, but he still visited this factory regularly, and it was where the revolution had started, and it held special meaning. Marcus nodded, and they had implemented the same reforms at 12 other facilities, and some transformations had been smooth, and others had been difficult, but all had succeeded, and the approach worked. And respect and investment in people always produced better results than exploitation. And neglect. Lisa Thompson had been promoted too, and she now served as regional manufacturing director, overseeing 4 facilities, and she had proven herself to be an exceptional leader, and fair, but demanding, and compassionate but results-oriented, and workers respected her because she had walked in their shoes, and she understood their challenges and never asked for anything she would not do herself. Jake had become the lead innovation coordinator, and his job was to identify workers with good ideas and help them develop those ideas into reality. And he traveled to different facilities, finding hidden talent and giving people opportunities to contribute. And over the past year, his program had generated 43 significant improvements across the company. Linda still worked on the factory floor, and she had been offered management positions but had turned them down, and she loved her work and loved training new employees and loved maintaining the safety standards she had fought so hard to establish, and she was happy where she was. And Marcus respected that, and not everyone wanted to climb the ladder, and some people found fulfillment in mastering their craft. Paul had been promoted to director of maintenance for the facility, and his preventive scheduling system had been adopted company-wide, saving millions in repair costs and preventing countless breakdowns. And he had a team of 30 now, and all of them trained in the proactive approach he had pioneered. Marcus and Carlos walked through the factory together, and workers greeted them warmly but without fear or excessive deference, and the relationship between management and workers had become one of mutual respect, and authority came from competence and character, not from titles or hierarchy. They stopped at a workstation where a young woman named Claire was operating a complex assembly machine, and she was new and only 3 months with the company, but she worked with confidence and precision. Claire looked up and smiled, and she gestured around the facility, and Marcus and Carlos thanked her and moved on. But that brief conversation meant everything, and new workers already understood the culture and already felt the difference, and the transformation had become self-sustaining. In the cafeteria, workers ate high-quality meals and relaxed in comfortable surroundings, and the space was full but not chaotic. And people talked and laughed, and the atmosphere was more like a community gathering than a factory break room. And this was what Marcus had envisioned, and a place where people wanted to be, and where work was not a burden, but an opportunity. Susan and Rita sat together as they did most days, and Susan said, and Rita smiled, and she had gotten married 6 months ago, and the wedding had been paid for in part by her bonus from the company profit-sharing program. That evening, Marcus hosted a dinner for the original team that had led the transformation, and Jake and Linda and Paul and Carlos and Lisa all gathered in a private room at the best restaurant in the colony, and the crystal trophy from the award ceremony sat at the center of the table, as a reminder of what they had achieved together. Marcus raised his glass, and they all drank, and then Lisa spoke, and the others nodded in agreement. Jake added, and he was right, and they all had, and the factory had given them opportunities to grow and contribute and to use their talents and to make a real difference, and that was worth more than any salary or title. Later, Marcus stood alone on the balcony looking out at the factory lights glowing against the night sky, and he thought about the journey, and about walking through those gates in disguise, and about being mocked and dismissed, and about seeing the rot that had infected his company, and about making the hard decision to tear out that rot and rebuild. It had been painful and 17 people had lost their jobs and relationships had been destroyed and reputations had been damaged, but it had been necessary, and sometimes you had to break things to fix them, and sometimes mercy required justice first. But Marcus had no regrets, and he had seen the alternative in the path of ignoring problems and hoping they would resolve themselves. And that path led to disaster, and to accidents and injuries, and to broken equipment and failed operations, and to demoralized workers, and declining quality, and he had chosen the harder path of confronting reality and demanding better, and that path had led to success. Patricia Lynn sent him a message, and he had been expecting it, and the board wanted him to testify before the Colonial Congress about workplace standards, and his story had attracted political attention, and legislators wanted to know if new regulations were needed to prevent the kind of mismanagement he had discovered. Marcus thought about his response, and he was not sure regulations were the answer and rules could be followed in letter while being violated in spirit. And what mattered was culture and values and leadership that genuinely cared about people. And you could not legislate that. But maybe he could inspire it. He would testify and he would tell his story again, and not to shame anyone but to teach and to show what was possible when leaders chose to serve rather than rule, and when managers chose to listen rather than command, and when companies chose to invest in people rather than exploit them. The next morning, Marcus prepared for another surprise inspection, and this time at a different facility on a different planet, and he packed his simple clothes and worn shoes in the same outfit he had worn a year ago, and some executives thought he was crazy to keep doing these inspections, and they said he had proven his point. But Marcus disagreed. Vigilance was eternal, and culture could slip if you stopped paying attention, and standards could erode if you stopped checking, and he would continue these inspections for as long as he ran the company, and not because he distrusted his managers, but because he owed it to his workers to see reality with his own eyes before leaving. He walked the factory floor one more time, and he stopped at Linda's station, and she was training 2 new workers in proper safety procedures, and she looked up and smiled when she saw him, and he asked, and Linda laughed. Marcus smiled, and she had, and that was his test, and if the workers wanted him to come back, then he was doing something right, and if they feared his visits, then something was wrong, and fear meant secrets, and secrets meant problems. But here there were no secrets, and just honest work by people who took pride in what they did. As his shuttle lifted off from the colony, Marcus looked down at the factory one last time, and from this height, it looked like a tiny glowing jewel set in the dark valley, but he knew it was so much more than that, and it was a community and a family and a place where thousands of people came together every day to build something bigger than themselves. That was the real legacy of his undercover inspection, and not the firings or the reforms or even the award, and the real legacy was proving that business could be different, and that companies could succeed by treating people well, and that profit and principle were not enemies, but partners, and that leadership meant service, not dominance. These were simple truths, and his grandfather had known them when he walked the railroad tracks decades ago, and Marcus had relearned them when he walked the factory floor in disguise, and now thousands of leaders across human space were learning them too. And the movement was spreading, and the culture was changing, and the future was bright. And it had all started with one man willing to take off his expensive suit and put on worn clothes, and willing to be mocked and insulted, and willing to see the truth even when it was ugly, and willing to act on that truth even when it was hard, and that was leadership, and that was what it meant to truly serve the people who depended on you. Marcus closed his eyes as the shuttle accelerated toward orbit, and he was tired, but satisfied, and the work was never finished. But it was good work and important work, and work that mattered, and tomorrow he would put on those worn clothes again, and he would walk through another factory gate, and he would see with his own eyes how his people lived and worked, and if he found problems he would fix them, because that was what leaders did and they served.